My guest today is Dan Crooks, who is going to be telling us the story of his grandmother and her brother, who as children lived through a terrifying experience. Dan, this could be made into a movie. Would you mind telling us what happened this dreadful day in 1866, I believe?
Yes, well, actually it's 1865 in October, and it happened about 40 miles north of Fort Worth, Texas, where my great-grandfather lived, John Babb. And he had his wife, a neighbor that had stopped by, a young lady, and his two children were at the house. John Babb himself and his older son had gone on a horse trading run to Arkansas, left the other family at home. The children, my grandmother, Bianca Babb, who was 9 years old, her brother, 13, were out in the yard playing, and they looked up and saw about 30, 40 Indians. They were on their way racing pretty hard, so it wasn't a everyday visit.
They knew where they were going.
They knew where they were going. They were where my uncle, great-grandfather Babb had put the ranch was in Indian hunting ground, and they had come out of what is now known as Oklahoma at that time, Indian Territory. So they were on their raids, picking up horses, whatever they could get, and my great-grandfather's ranch was one of them. So they came on, my great-grandmother called the children into the house and into the ranch house, and the Indians took it upon themselves just to follow. They didn't even wait for an invitation. They came in ripping things apart, stealing clothes, and when my grandmother protested, they knifed her. One of the Indian chiefs did, and he knifed her, and then they took the children outdoors, and the school teacher visitor that was at the house, Mrs. Lester. Oh,
well, now how come
she was a widow?
How come they knifed or shot
my great-grandmother?
Yes,
she was protesting. She was protesting because they were tearing her house up and taking her children.
Mrs. Lester didn't protest then?
Not to my knowledge. She didn't protest. The main thing was that they seemed to want the children, the two small children. And they used them to raise them Indian ways, and they've got more to their tribes. And the Indian chief went back into the house to find out if there's anything left. Grandmother was still, even though she was knifed and hurting, she was still alive, so he shot her with an arrow. She fell across the bed. The little baby, who wasn't even a year old, Aunt Margie, they never bothered her because she was sick, and Indians didn't want sick children. So they left the little baby with her mother, lying on the bed. The mother was dying, and they took the children, and that within itself was quite a story too. Crossing the Red River, they put Uncle Dot and my grandmother on a horse. The river was very flooded, and they put her on a horse, and they made their horse go across first. If they got swept away, so they got swept away. If they made it, then the Indians could make it. But they made it. They ended up downstream over 1 mile from where they went in, from the swift current, because that Red River can be quite a deluge of water when it wants to get up rip-roaring. After they got across, they sleeping that night, Uncle Dot sneaked away during the night where the horses were shackled, and got a horse and brought it back close to the camp, woke up Miss Lester and got her over on. He got two horses really, and they were going to escape.
Well, now was he going to take his sister with him?
Yes, he was. He was going to have her ride with him, and then Miss Lester on the other horse.
But she didn't know about the plan, evidently.
Not really. He got back and awakened her, and they went out and got on the horse, and they made a lot of noise doing it. He got her away on the horse, but he never had a chance to get himself and grandmother away. So for this great deed of his, they were going to kill him. So the next day, they sent out a hunt party. They couldn't find Ms. Lester. So then they figured she had tried to cross that river again and was drowned or swept away. She didn't. She headed north. We found out later.
Oh, really?
Grandmother found out later. So then the Indians were going to kill Uncle Dot. They tied him to a tree, put brush, tree, and so forth around him, and were going to light the fire around him, and he got to laughing at them. Grandmother told me that he was scared, but he was laughing anyway. She went into hysterics, and they thought she was laughing, and he was thinking it funny. That's the way they were going to die, being burned to stake, and they turned him loose.
Because he was evidently brave.
That brave. They figured if he can laugh at his own death, and she can laugh, then they were worthwhile keeping. So at that point, they were on the Canadian River. They took my Uncle Dot, great Uncle Dot, whose real name was Adolphus, but Dot for short. They took him and put him with another Indian tribe and kept my grandmother with this one. The chief that was in charge of the raid, he had a sister that had lost her husband. She was very young, she lost her husband, so he gave my grandmother to her.
Oh,
that was to be her child. So grandmother, all she knew of this woman was squaw mother. So that's what, and I met the woman, she was up in her 90s, in 1934. And she still couldn't speak any English. And grandmother could talk to her, because grandmother never forgot her Indian language. So I met the squaw mother, but grandmother said she treated her very well.
Oh, really?
And watched her like a hawk.
Well, now, how did the children of the camp treat her?
When they first went into camp, they liked her. So they named her, and Tiana, which is Texas, in their language, and so her name was Tiana.
Now, what happened to the brother?
The brother went on to another camp, and he got to playing with the children and learning their tricks and trades of bow and arrow, hunting, and he was very good. So they made him a warrior. He went on raids with them against other Indian tribes. They would never let him go under a raid against a white tribe or white ranchers in Oklahoma, or would they let him cross the Red River into Texas. But that's about the extent of his raiding parties and so forth.
How were the children finally rescued?
If you'd like to appear on Hidden Treasures, you can contact Dottie Vanderbeck at 753-1119.
Children finally rescued?
Well, grandfather, when he got back from Arkansas, about 3 or 4 months later, with his horses, found his family gone. A colonel, Army colonel out of Austin, Texas, had gone by, was a friend of theirs. They had gone by their ranch and noticed how quiet it was. And he went in, this was 3 days later, and found my great-grandmother lying on the bed, and she was still alive after 3 days, but she died right after that, and the little baby, my great-aunt Margie. He took Aunt Margie, he saw what had happened, he took Aunt Margie to a neighbor, which was about 2 or 3 miles down the road, and left her there, and then he went back to Austin to report, to Fort Worth, then on to Austin to report, and to the governor. When my grandfather got back, he went up there and told him what he had found. Of course, it was all the buzz of the neighborhood, you more or less say, of what had happened. And that was one of the last Indian raids that was performed down in that territory.
Oh, really?
They were in one of the last group. So grandfather immediately, my great-grandfather, immediately started trying to find out where his children were. So he went to Arbuckle, Fort Arbuckle in Oklahoma, to the Army post up there, he and the colonel, and they found an Indian chief that was in good favors with the whites. In fact, he had a lot to do in negotiating peace treaty with the governor of Texas. just for the Indian Territory. He got in touch with him, and though they would not allow any of the white men, my great-grandfather and them, to go back into the Indian country, the chief went back in and found the children. He had a good idea where they were. Mm-hmm. He found the children and started making bargaining. So it took almost a year to get this bargaining in. Even though they knew where the children were, they couldn't just go take them. The soldiers couldn't. There would have been a real massacre there. So my great-grandfather ended up with approximately 40 horses, blankets, flour, and one of their highest prizes, coffee. Wanted coffee. And it all came to about $800 worth, but in those days, that was quite a
lot
ransom.
of money. Mm-hmm.
So he went back to the Indian chief and told him what he had. Here it is. What can you do? The Indian chief made the arrangements, and when they went to get grandmother, the Indian chief and one white soldier, my grandfather still was not, great-grandfather was not allowed to go in. One white soldier was allowed to go in, and when they got there, they told the squaw mother that she was going to have to give up my grandmother. She got grandmother and ran away with her. And the Indians went and brought her back. They said a bargain is a bargain. The horses are worth more than she is. Mm-hmm. So she had to give up grandmother.
Did they punish the squaw mother for running away with your grandmother?
No, they understood that her feelings towards my grandmother, so they did not punish her for it.
I imagine your grandmother and uncle were very glad that they were being rescued.
Yes, yes, they were. But grandmother was only allowed to have 2 dresses. They were gingham dresses. All these nearly 3 years she was a captive, and so she had her buffalo robe. The squaw mother let her keep her buffalo robe for warmth, and they headed for Fort Arbuckle. They waited there about 2 weeks, and then my Uncle Dot, they brought him in. And so after a happy reunion, they headed back to Texas. When they got to Texas, my great-grandfather changed his mind, took the children, and went to back to their home in Wisconsin for just a little while to regroup as a family, then back to the ranch in Texas and rebuilt his ranch there.
Wow. Well, I'm looking at a very unusual bear. What is this? Well, it is a bear, but...
It's a little bear. It's old. It's 1861. When my great-grandfather went into Fort Worth one time to get supplies, they always tried to buy something for the family. So he bought grandmother this little bear to play with. So that was her little bear. She had it out in the yard with her in 1865 when the hunting party came by, and she dropped it.
She didn't take it with her?
She didn't take it with her.
Oh, that's...
But so that one is about 127 years old now.
Dan, I do have one more question. Did your grandmother ever meet up with any of the Comanche tribes after she was rescued?
Yes, in 1934 they had a big meeting up in Oklahoma, and I went to that in 1934, though I was just 10 years old. And that's where I met the squaw mother, my Uncle Dot, first time I remember ever seeing him, and my grandmother and Uncle Dot, both speaking language, had themselves quite a day.
I bet they did.
And so, yes, there was numerous meetings. There was a big one in Fort Worth one time, and that was even put on television back in early 1950s. So she didn't dislike the Indians for what they did. She felt sorry for them for the way they lived. And so that was her main remembrance, was feeling sorry for them.
Well, this has really been an interesting story, and I want to thank you, Dan.
All right.
If you'd like to appear on Hidden Treasures, you can contact Dottie Vanderbeck at 753-1119.